about today's webinar. Merrill will break several times during her presentation to answer any questions you have. You can submit any questions you have in the chat window at any time during the presentation. It is located in the lower part of your screen. Our webinar will end promptly today at 1 o'clock to respect your time. The session is being recorded, and the link to the recording will be available at fairfieldcounty.score.org within the next couple of days. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's webinar. Merrill Loechner has been working in marketing and business development for over 3 decades. After getting her degree in communications, she worked with lawyers, scientists, and engineers across the world, from small technology startups to multinational corporations. As a marketing consultant and podcast producer, she helps small and growing companies find their voice. She coaches her clients on the power of storytelling to differentiate themselves in crowded markets. I'll now turn it over to Merrill. Merrill, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Mike. As Mike said, my name is Merrill Loechner, and today is Podcasting for Business. What I'll be doing is breaking this up into a few sections. I'll give you a brief overview about who I am and what I do, then followed by part 1, who, what, where. What is a podcast? Who listens to it? And where can you find podcasts? Followed by how to be on a podcast, either as an advertiser or a sponsor or a guest. Part 3, how to produce your own podcast. What technology do you need? Finally, we'll be going over how to use podcasts as a marketing tool. So to start, this is me. This is me a few years ago and a few pounds ago, but I like this picture. So I have always loved stories. I taught myself how to read at 2.5, and by the time I started in kindergarten, I had already read everything Agatha Christie ever wrote, my poor kindergarten teacher. But I also discovered that I not only like to read stories, I like to start writing them. Meaning, as I was a really obnoxious 4th grader, I got my first check, which is like the coolest thing in the world. So I decided this is what I wanted to do with my life. So I got my degree in communications up in Henniker, New Hampshire, and they also had a campus in Arundel, which was very cool. And when I graduated, I needed to make a choice. Did I want to become a world-famous author, or did I want health insurance? So off I went to work in corporate marketing for the next 30 years, where I worked primarily in the STEM fields at teaching scientists and engineers, and near the end, lawyers, on how to talk to people who did not have their same background. And if you've ever had to try to have a conversation between scientists and engineers and computer programmers, you know how the jargon can get in the way. And a few years ago, I started Smith Douglas so I can take that ability and start teaching small business owners how to tell their stories. So what does this have to do with podcasting? How I got into podcasting? Well, in January of about 2015, I was working on an article on management styles and how do really good bosses put together good teams. And I had a friend in Pittsburgh who suggested, oh, you should talk with Jim Rutherford. He just became the general manager of the Pittsburgh Penguins. And my first response was, the what? The who? Is that a sport? Well, it turned out to be hockey. Oh, okay. I know nothing about hockey. Let me start looking into this. And I fell in love. I was absolutely enthralled by how hockey teams build a hockey team. How do you build a great team under a hard salary cap? And then came June 2015, and the Blackhawks won the Stanley Cup, and everyone stopped writing about hockey. All the journalists went, wow, that was a great season. See you in the fall. But I wasn't done learning. And at that point, I also was working at a law firm as a director of marketing with an 1.5-hour commute each way. So that's when I discovered podcasts. There were all these people still doing podcasts about hockey. So I could still learn about a topic I was really interested in while I was commuting. Wow, this is great. And I realized this is an incredible source for long-form storytelling. At the time, I was helping out the Bethel Chamber of Commerce, and I went up to them. I'm like, "Hey guys, let's do a podcast?" And then they said, "Great." And I thought, "Great, I have no idea what I'm doing." So, being self-taught, I start putting together the Bethel Chamber of Commerce, the Bethel Business Podcast. And it worked. We actually put a podcast together that people were listening to. We actually had some subscribers from Japan, which I don't know why, but that was very cool. And that was kind of my stepping off point working as a podcast producer. Currently, I'm working on several others, including some podcasts for some local networking groups, and also working on one for a law firm up in Danbury. So that's how I got into podcasting and some of the podcasts I'm working on now. So let's get back to what, who, and where. What is a podcast for those of you who may not know? Think of it as a radio show. If you've ever listened to NPR, This American Life, All Things Considered, that sounds very much like a podcast these days. But unlike a radio show, this is listen on demand. It's streamable, it's downloadable. You can listen onto your phone, listen on your computer. You can download it or stream it. They're also episodic, kind of like the old radio shows. You can't just do a podcast, it's a series. A lot of them are interview based. So it's people interviewing guests. Sometimes it's a panel that's talking about a particular topic. There are also a lot of that out there that are purely entertainment based. One of my favorite early podcasts to listen to is Welcome to Night Vale, which someone once suggested sounded like public radio as in the Twilight Zone. So pretty much you can find any topic that you're looking for. Now, where did the word podcast come from? Well, back in February of 2004, a journalist named Ben Hammersley with The Guardian was writing an article about these new audio blog things that were starting to become popular. And he wanted to name it something. So, well, since you listen to a lot of it on your iPod and it's a broadcast, let's turn a portmanteau into podcast. Now, who are listening to podcasts these days? Well, let's find out. Based on the US population, 70% of America at least knows what a podcast is. 50% has listened to at least one podcast. 30% listens at least once a month. And 1 out of 5 Americans listen to a podcast at least once a week. Okay. Gender, it's about 50-50, men and women. Age, again, kind of across the board, not really surprising based on technology. Education, usually well-educated people, because one of the reasons people listen to podcasts is they want to be educated about a specific topic. And for income, again, it's usually people with money. So needless to say, advertisers love podcasts because they're smart and they have money. Okay, where do people listen? And this was very surprising because for the past decade, the number one place for people to listen to a podcast was their car. And then, well, this pandemic happened. So as of April, the number one place where people listen to podcasts now are in their home. Not surprisingly, 20% is still while driving, 11% at work. Exercising, if you see people at the gym or jogging while they're wearing headphones, there's a good chance they're listening to a podcast. Public transportation and elsewhere. This is one of the reasons a lot of podcasts are still around 30 minutes because that's kind of considered the average commute time. Okay, you want to find a podcast, where do you start? Well, like most places these days, you start with Google. What people are looking for is what I usually call the for search or the about search. They're looking for about a topic or for a market. So let's try something. We're looking, whoops, there we go. Well, podcasts about cats. Okay. Well, yes, there are podcasts about cats, including the top 10 cat podcasts you must follow in 2020. Must check out that link later. Okay, let's see if this thing goes on. Okay, well, that's so much for the animation. That was podcasts about science fiction. Okay, We have science fiction podcasts every nerd should listen to. And those blocks along the top, those are actually links directly to Google Podcasts. We can actually start listening to episodes. But again, this is podcasting for business. You're a lawyer. You want to know if there's podcasts for lawyers out there. So, podcasts for lawyers. Be it known, there are more podcasts for and about and by lawyers than any other industry out there, including Above the Law, which is one of the more popular podcasts out there that have been there for a while. But yeah, God, there's millions of podcasts for lawyers. I want to target it down to podcasts for divorce lawyers. There is podcasts for divorce lawyers. So honestly, when you're doing any searching out there, you can search very specifically, and you will probably find a podcast that you're interested in. There's two places you'll find these things. There's pod sources. These host the original sound files, and they'll only index things within its own environment. So you're looking at SoundCloud, you'll only find podcasts that are hosted by SoundCloud. Same thing with Stitcher. However, what they do is they generate what's called an RSS feed, which is a real simple service feed, which goes out to the podcatchers. Podcatchers include Google Podcast, iTunes, Player FM, Spotify, and about 1,000 others. So once you post something on a pod source, it will be picked up by the podcatchers. And lately, one of the big podcasting platforms has been YouTube. It will host original sound files, but it won't pick up an RSS feed. So if you'd like to post on multiple places, you'll have to physically add things to YouTube. Okay, this will be our first question break. And Mike, do we have any questions yet from our crew?
Well, I have one for you. You showed the age distribution of podcast listeners, and it seemed as it was a pretty even distribution.
Yep, pretty much goes from 18 to 65 is pretty evenly broken out. It goes down a little after 65, but actually it's starting to pick up again, especially when people are stuck home and they're looking to learn new things. One thing that are good about podcasts is you don't have to sit still and watch something like you do in a video. If you want to learn something while you're vacuuming the house or dusting or gardening, you can just plug in a pair of headphones and listen to a podcast.
Okay. And you also noted that, half the podcasts are listened to at home, which, we're in a unique environment. I was wondering if you might think about, assuming we go back to a more normal environment at some point, would you expect the age distribution to change at all? And would you expect the location of the listening of the podcasts to go back to what it was before, or change from what it is now?
I would think it would really depend on habit. Does it become a habit to listen to a podcast on your computer while you're doing other work? Or again, putting on your headphones and gardening or doing something around the house? For a long time, like I said, it was commuters were the number one pickup on podcasts. But now it's simply that if you want to learn something and you don't want to use your eyes, you're not sitting still, you're out, you're gardening, you're jogging. Even I have a tendency to listen to podcasts and play solitaire. So I can listen, but I don't need to use my eyes to learn.
Okay, good. Good question here from Beth is, how do you figure out what is the best time to share your podcast?
There really isn't a great time. If you have a podcast you're producing and you have regular episodes, you try to launch the episodes at around the same time. If you're doing it weekly, do it Mondays or Tuesdays, pick a day. If you're doing monthly, same thing. It's first Monday of the month, the new podcast will be out. It's kind of like a TV show. You want to have something out, but think of the Netflix generation. People will listen when they want to listen, not when you want them to listen. So it doesn't really matter what days or times you launch it as long as you're consistent.
Okay, good. Video podcasts, are they as popular or more popular than audio podcasts?
We'll actually be talking about that in section 4, so save your questions for that.
Okay. Another question I have, a lot of questions coming in. I'm trying to keep up. Just to confirm what you said before, when you post the podcast to one of the podcasters, that works for everybody except for YouTube, right? You need to post separately on YouTube.
You need to post separately on YouTube.
Okay. Can you embed a podcast into your website?
Absolutely, and we'll be discussing that further in as well.
Okay.
So any questions about just the little bit we've covered so far? Because we've still got
I
another
take a break and
40
let you
minutes to go.
Why don't I let you go ahead here, Merrill?
Okay, excellent. Okay. Okay, so how to be on a podcast. You've been listening to podcasts and you're thinking, wow, hey, I want to be a part of this. I want my voice to be on someone's podcast. So there's pretty much two ways to do this. You can be a guest, or you can be an advertiser and a sponsor. So let's talk about being a guest first. Okay, so how do you get to be a guest on a podcast? Well, first thing, you want to search for podcasts that reach your target audience. If you want to kind of use this as a sales tool or a way to grow your market, honestly, you're going to need to find a place that hits that target audience. Also, about a topic that you know. You don't want to join a hockey podcast and to talk about your law firm because they're going to ask you hockey questions. Also, make sure the podcast you're interested in has guests because not all podcasts have guests. So, okay, you found a podcast that you really like that you want to possibly try to be a guest on. One of the things you want to do is subscribe, rate, and comment on that podcast. A lot of podcasts out there live and die on their ratings. If you go into iTunes and search for podcasts there, the ones with the 5 stars come up first. It's kind of like the Google rankings. So if you find a podcast you like, always rate them. 5 stars are always a good thing. And if you want to reach out to these people, comment on the podcast. You can comment on iTunes. A lot of podcasters also have social media. So find their Facebook page, find their Twitter feeds, go onto their websites and comments there. So the hosts, the producers recognize your name. So that way, when you reach out to the producer with a pitch, you're not cold calling. You're not just saying, hey, I heard one episode of your podcast and I think I'd be a great guest. You want to engage with them first before coming on and asking to be a guest. And also be a little realistic. The smaller podcasters are always looking for content. This American Life has 3.1 million subscribers. It may be a little harder to be a guest on there unless you're like Barack Obama or something and the like. So be realistic when looking out to which podcast you want to be a guest to. And if they say, yeah, absolutely, would love you to be a guest, you may be asked to come into a studio. Or nowadays, more than likely, you may be asked to call in. If you are, do not script anything out. This is so obvious because you are supposed to be an expert in your field. And if you are reading from something, you sound fake. So never, ever, ever script anything out. And always to make sure to listen to a lot of previous expert episodes of the show so you're not surprised if the host has a tendency to like ask leading questions or startling. You don't want to be surprised by that. So you don't want to go on thinking you're going to have a serious PBS style question and answer and discover the host is a shock jock. So go in well educated. Okay, you found some podcasts you like, but they don't accept guests. What can you do? Well, you can either do an advertisement or a sponsorship. So let's talk advertising first. Say you already do radio ads. This is great. You can just take that radio ad and plunk it right in their podcast. God knows Geico does that. If you listen to a podcast a lot, Geico advertises on 90% of the podcasts out there. You can place an ad on a single podcast. Again, if you're listening to a podcast you really like and you want to place an ad there, you can. But most of the advertising and these kind of ads are done through a network. One of the podcatchers out there is called Anchor FM. And what you can do is say, if you are like Geico or a mattress company, you don't really have a specific target. You just want to carpet bomb. You want to get as many people as you can. You can put that ad through a network and they will just plunk your ad in a podcast. And it will either be pre-roll, before the podcast, in the middle, mid-roll, or at the end of the podcast as a post-roll. And remember what I said, and subscribers are important. This is how people figure out price of advertising. It's an average cost, and this was 2018 numbers, so it may be a little higher now, but you have a 30-second ad, it's going to be $18 per 1,000 subscribers, which again, This American Life, 3.1 million subscribers. You can do the math and figure out the ad costs on here. I usually tell my clients, though, to think about advertising. This is an actual screenshot of my phone, listening to one of my own podcasts. Now, see this little thing that says 30 with a little arrow on it? This lets me tap on that button and immediately go 30 seconds past what I'm listening to. So if I hear an ad come up on a podcast, I'm going to tap that and skip the ad completely. This is very similar to the way people fast forward through TV commercials. So the one problem with doing physical ads on podcasts, or people have the technology to skip them. So just something to keep in mind. So the other option is sponsoring a podcast. You can sponsor more than one episode, or you can just do one episode. The podcast host, like, thank you for joining our podcast. Today's episode is hosted by Acme Vibrating Cat Beds. One of the things they also do is what's called a read. Is somewhere in the podcast, the host will read a short blurb about your company or product. I've seen this done multiple ways. One podcast I listen to, he'll actually stop the podcast and say, and now a word from our sponsor. He'll read your blurb, and now back to the podcast. One of the more successful ways I've heard a sponsor do this is another one of my hockey podcasts, is they actually make a read part of the podcast, and they make it a competition among the three hosts who could do the best read, who could do the best transition from what they're talking about to the read, something along the like, wow, did you see that goal last night? That was excellent. That was razor sharp precision. And speaking of razors, the men's razor club. And then the hosts judge each other on the transition. And what they also do is they engage their listeners. So it's like, okay, how was our transition? So people listening to this podcast actually are waiting to hear the sponsorship read. They're actually looking forward. It's become a vital part of the podcast itself. And if you can find a podcast that'll do that, fantastic. Another thing they do is sponsors usually send free samples of the product to the host so they can talk about it. Another podcast I listen to is sponsored by a mattress company, and they're saying, oh my God, we slept so well. This is the best mattress we ever had. Da, 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 da. And so what to look for when you're thinking about sponsoring a podcast? Look at podcast reviews. Again, look at those 5 stars. You want to get people who actually have a lot of subscribers. You also want to look at their current and other past podcast sponsors. Are there any of your competition there? Is this really the right market you want to go to? Listener engagement. Again, check out Facebook, check out Twitter. Do they have a very active online listener engagement fandom? Is it good quality content? Do you really want to put your name on with what you're listening to? And again, relevancy to your business. Okay, that's pretty much on how to get on a podcast as a guest or an advertiser. Do we have any questions about those topics?
Merrill, you had some information on the cost to advertise on a podcast. And then you also talked about the ability to either sponsor or go through, I think you called it the read promotion, whatever. Do you have any idea about the cost to do the latter two versus the cost to advertise on a podcast?
It really depends on the podcast. And once again, it depends on how many subscribers they have and if they're part of a network. Usually network usually only do ads. The independent podcasts will do sponsors. So again, it's the if you find podcasts you like, listen to see if it's the and this episode is sponsored by blah blah blah. Sometimes they have more than one sponsor. So if you hear ads, they probably don't have sponsors. If you hear sponsors, they probably don't have ads. And it's ones that take sponsors will usually, again, it really depends on how many subscribers they have based on sponsorship and if you just want to sponsor one podcast or multiple episodes.
Okay, good. And if you're buying time, advertising time on a podcast, can you buy it by geographic territory or any other types of parameters?
When you're going through a network, yes, you can usually go to the network and say, okay, I'm looking to primarily sponsor, the market I'm looking for is males 18 to 34 living in the West Coast who are interested in skateboarding. It's similar to advertising in magazines. You kind of look for the target you're hitting, and then you can buy time in that area. It's like most other media buys, especially when going through networks.
Okay. Now, if I'm a small business, I can look at advertising through different types of media. It could be a podcast, could be on YouTube, could be on something else. Do you have a feel for what may be the most cost-effective vehicle, podcast versus some of the other things?
It's really, again, depends on your market, depends on who you're trying to hit and how. Actually, being a guest on a podcast will probably get you more bang for your buck than actually just throwing in an ad, because that's your voice talking about your product, your service, and why you're an expert in that field. Advertising is good, but honestly, unless you're Geico, I really wouldn't bother putting the little ads in there because it's just too easy to skip over. However, if you, again, I'm talking hockey podcasts. If you sell hockey equipment and you want to sponsor this hockey podcast and then talk about saying, well, people who are hockey fans may really want to start learning the sport, and here's a best way to buy new equipment. It really depends on the focus. Again, if you're a divorce lawyer, possibly doing a sponsorship on that. It's like, what makes you different from all the other divorce lawyers out there? Oh, I only deal with the men. I only deal with men with red hair in New York City. Again, it's focusing the target that you're looking for.
Okay. One more question, and this might jump ahead, so let me know. What would be the best way, this is from me sponsoring or creating a podcast, to get your podcast ranked higher in searches, through SEO, et cetera?
Rating. Pretty much the only way you do that is if you get subscribers and rating. That's how it gets up.
Okay, that's all the questions we have for now, so you can go ahead.
Okay, let's move on to how to produce your own podcast. So you've decided, I really don't want to be a guest. I want to do this all myself. Okay, these are some questions to ask first. Who's your audience? Who do you want to hit? What message do you want to tell them? Do you have enough to say to cover multiple episodes? Remember, a podcast isn't just a one-off. Minimum, you have to do it once a month. You can do it once a week. I listen to a couple of podcasts that are twice a week. I listen to some that do 2 hours every single day. It also depends, how long do you want the episode to be? The average is about 30 minutes. I listen to some that are 2 hours. And there's a dentist out there that does a podcast that is exactly 2 minutes long. Can you figure out why a dentist would want a 2-minute podcast? Because that's how long he wants you to brush your teeth. You turn on his podcast, you start brushing your teeth, and you don't stop until he's done, which I thought was very clever. But so one of the things you have to think about is how long you want your podcast to be. What format do you want to use? Are you just going to lecture people for 30 minutes? Here's a hint, don't do that, it will be boring. Do you want to be the host and interview people once a week or once a month? Do you want to have other people? Do you want to have 2 or 3 people? Do you want to record conversations? Do you want to have a panel on specific topics? One podcast I listened to for a while were these three women up in Vancouver, British Columbia, watching episodes of the original Star Trek. One was a Trekkie, one had never seen an episode, and one kind of sort of remembered it. And they would give their reviews after every episode. And it was really very funny because the person who'd never seen an episode was in human resources, and she really wanted to talk with Starfleet HR because, oh my God, look at all those problems. Do you want advertisers and sponsors? Because if you do, that may be some way to make a little bit of money. But then again, if you're using this as a marketing tool, do you really want other people trying to make money off your marketing tool? What name do you want to call it? This can be a lot harder than you originally thought, and I'll get to that in a second. And here's the number one question to ask yourself. Why would anyone want to listen to your podcast? It's great if you want to say, oh, I have all these things to teach people. But again, why would anyone want to listen? What do you have that's unique? What do you have that nobody else is saying? Because this is something you're going to have to realize what you are competing against. There are currently 850,000 podcasts out there with 30 million episodes in 100 languages. Remember when I mentioned about how hard it is to find a really good podcast name? I'm launching a different podcast probably around September. It's taken me 6 weeks to find a really cool podcast name that hasn't already been taken. Because again, 850,000 podcasts out there, whatever clever name you come up with, probably has been taken. So be aware of one of the things that you're going against. So what equipment do you need? And I'm going to go over some basic equipment, some intermediate, and some advanced stuff. Okay, basic equipment. Everyone listening to this podcast has the ability to start podcasting this afternoon because you have the basic equipment. You have a cell phone. Any smartphone, iOS, Android, whatever, now has apps where you can record directly into those apps to create a podcast. Anchor, Podcast Studio, Podbeam, Spreaker, Ringer. All of these allow you to record directly on your phone, to edit on your phone, and to hit publish, and it will automatically work as an RSS feed generator. And if you want slightly better sound quality, you can also get external microphones for your cell phone. Use two lavalier mics. My first podcast with the Bethel Chamber of Commerce was done this way. I actually recorded everything on my phone. And the sound quality was, you can tell you're using phone. So if you're trying to do something low cost of entry, basic sound, don't have that much control over it, but it's quick and dirty. You can do everything on your phone. So that's the way I did actually my first 1.5 podcasts. Then I decided I wanted to get slightly better audio equipment. So the next step was instead of recording into your phone, you record into your computer. This gives you a little more space so you can do longer podcasts, and it gives you a little better control of the results. For microphones, you can use headset mics like the ones I'm currently wearing, or you can move on to USB mics. This is a Blue Yeti. This is what I moved on to. So this is what a lot of my sound podcasts were recorded on for my second and the beginning of my third podcast. What I liked about the Blue Yeti is there's a dial in the back of it. So you can have it unidirectional. It will only record what's coming directly in front of it. Bidirectional, it will be great for when you're doing an interview. You have the mic in the middle of the table, you're having a conversation, the mic picks up in those two directions. Then they have what's cardioid, which is kind of this heart-shaped sound that was primarily in front of you, but a little background. And then they have omnidirectional, which picks up all the background noise, which if you're doing a recording on location and you want to get some ambient noise, that's great. It could be a little annoying if you don't want background noise. Then there's editing software. I use a freeware called Audacity. You can also use things like GarageBand, and there's a lot of other software out there for editing. I like Audacity. It's very powerful. There's a bit of a learning curve, but there's also 8 million YouTube videos out there that tells you step by step how to use the program, which I love. And one of the reasons I really like using Audacity is because I do commercial podcasts, because people pay me to produce podcasts, I want to make sure the people I'm recording sound fantastic. And so those of you who are in Toastmasters and know the counter, the ums, the ahs, the likes, the knows, the lip smacks, I can edit out all of them. I call it SBS editing, syllable by syllable. It gets to the point, if I'm in here for a few hours, I can see an coming along just by the shape of the sound spike. You can't really do that on your cell phone. So when you really want to get that kind of control, you're going to need external software. And finally, you're going to need a place to host it. I primarily use SoundCloud because, again, when I first started listening to hockey podcasts, they were all hosted on SoundCloud. On my phone now, I usually listen on Google Podcasts because I have an Android. But when I'm uploading podcasts, I'll put them onto SoundCloud to generate the RSS feed. But again, there's other places that you can choose to do that. Okay, so you've got that, but you really want to more better sound. So this January, I started updating my podcasting equipment, and I moved from a single mic in the middle of a table to everyone having their own individual microphone. And I use what's called the dynamic cardioid mic with an XLR cable. So instead of plugging it in to a USB, it's going into a separate recorder, which then goes into my computer. So this is one of the microphones I use now. And then I made a horrible mistake. I'm buying all this equipment in January, and I'm like, oh, I'm advanced. I'm a professional now. And I bought a soundboard. Now, to put this into a metaphor, recording on your podcast, well, that's a tricycle. That's good for just getting started. And your USB mic, well, that's going from your tricycle to a Huffy or a Schwinn. You've got your banana seat, you've got the comfy things, you're ready to go, maybe a couple of, baseball cards in the spikes. And that's where I was. Unfortunately, going to a soundboard was kind of like going from a Huffy to a fully tricked out Harley Davidson motorcycle. It was way more than I needed. I just kind of read the directions and went, oh, I am so out of my comfort zone. So I took a step back to a 10-speed bike, which is what I got. This was a portable recorder. And when I was researching, I kept seeing this phrase called ENG. It's an ENG device. I'm like, would someone tell me what an ENG means? And finally I realized electronic news gathering. Portable recorders are actually what's used a lot in the field. If you're watching, again, a sporting thing where they're talking to the coach and all holding these things, it's not all their phones. It's an electronic news gathering device. And what I like about this is if you see these things on the side, I can put up to 4 microphones on this basic unit. It's a little bigger than a cell phone, but not that big. And I could switch out these microphones up here to attach 2 more external mics. So I can sit down and talk to 5 people, all each with their own microphone, each recording on its own soundtrack. So this gives me complete control over the sound that I'm looking for. And then I can take the recording from this device and either plug in a USB cable, or it also has a sound card. So if I'm in the field, that's great, because I tend to do most of my podcast recording in my clients' offices. So now that everyone has their own mic, I get a lot less background noise from the sound of a busy office. And of course, I did all this in January, which, surprise, COVID. So I've got all this great equipment quietly gathering dust in my den, and I'm back to using the phone. One of the other things you can do if you're really getting into podcasting, you also can set up your own studio. You can get professional grade equipment, soundproofing, you can add video. This is really great. There's actually places that you can rent space here. I know up in Connecticut, there are a couple of libraries that now have podcasting studios available for you to rent. I believe Danbury Library has one of those. Okay, on setting up your own podcasting. Any questions on this?
Merrill, you noted that you use SoundCloud to host your site.
Mm-hmm.
And then you noted that earlier that the various podcatchers kind of pick up stuff from SoundCloud and other podcasters. Is it required that if you're producing your own podcast, do you need to create an account at all these various podcatchers?
You just need to have it on one pod hosting site. So I just have an account on SoundCloud. Once you have that account, it generates a code called an RSS feed, and that gets picked up with the podcatchers. I also have an account with iTunes and an account with Google Podcasts because I want to control when the RSS feed gets picked up. So I can go in and say, okay, here is the RSS feed. I want you to pick this up next week. Because if you just let it sit there, it will just pick up whenever it wants to pick up. But again, that also really depends on which pod sources you're looking at. Stitcher has slightly different parameters. LibSync has slightly different parameters. I just use SoundCloud out of habit.
Okay, but it's interesting. So you kind of quote unquote encourage the podcatchers to go pick up your podcast from the host.
It's kind of like if you post a new website, you know the Google spiders will eventually find it, or you can go straight to Google and say, hey, look, new shiny website. So I just take that extra step, and especially for the really big podcatchers, including iTunes, Google Play, which is now Google Podcast, and a few of the other big ones. And usually within a week, all the other small podcatchers had picked it up.
Question from Julie is, so how much does SoundCloud cost?
I believe it's $144 a year. It's about $12 a month. And that's about average. Some are a little higher, some are a little lower. You can also host on things like Anchor FM, but Anchor FM is also a advertising network. So you also, if you host for free on Anchor FM, they will put ads on your podcast, which if you're looking for advertising is great. If you're not so much.
Okay. Now here's a question for you. It may be, the answer maybe it depends, of course, but what sort of time commitment is there in developing and producing a podcast? And that's right from, pre-production all the way down to producing it, editing it, recording it, you name it.
Honestly, it's like starting another business. You have to go in the mindset, if you're planning to do your own podcast, go in thinking it's a separate business. You need to find a name, you need to find a market, you need to find an audience. You probably want a website for it. You want to have its own social media presence. So honestly, doing a podcast is like starting a whole other business, and you have to put the time in. And again, you can do it quick and dirty on your phone. Okay, here we are, we're interviewing this person, blah, 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 minimal editing, send, quick and dirty. And there's some really good podcasts that do that. One podcast I was listening to was 4 guys in a car with, occasional background music from the GPS system. So it depends on how much control you want on the podcast. If you're like me and you're a nitpicker, it could take several hours for every podcast. One podcast I worked on, the guy was stammering a lot, and I had to guide him through the questions. Normally for a half an hour podcast, I did 2 hours of recording and 16 hours of editing to get 30 usable minutes. So again, it depends on your own personality. How much of a nitpicker and perfectionist are you?
Okay, technical question for you. If you tape your podcast, how do you load it into something like GarageBand, which you had noted before?
Okay, if you mean from a tape recorder, I'm not sure because I don't know anyone who's still using tape. But yes, you can record on your phone and then save it to your computer. Once it's in your computer, you can upload it into GarageBand or Audacity. That's what I did with the Bethel Chamber of Commerce. I recorded everything on my phone, saved it onto my computer, uploaded it into Audacity, and then went on from there.
Okay, question here about sourcing and negotiating with advertisers. Is that something you do directly, or would you work through someone else to get the advertisers?
You can work through other people, but if you're going through a network like Anchor FM, you can negotiate directly with them because they're going to be putting your ad on multiple podcasts. And again, you work with them to tell them what you're looking for. You can negotiate prices directly with them. Because I don't know how many media buyers are out there working a lot with podcasts, but I'm sure there are out there. Like I said, I don't do a lot of advertising since my podcasts are functionally advertising themselves.
Mhm.
But I do know the easiest way to get started with that is going through network sites.
Okay. Uh, your podcasts, are they live or do you record them and then post them?
Oh, I edit the hell out of my podcast. So no, 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 never live. Like I say, I go through and take out every stutter, repetition. If I ask a question and they don't give me a really good answer, I'll let them talk a bit and then I'll ask the question again. And then later on, take that sound file, break it down almost like Legos and rebuild it. Because one of the things I'm trying to do again is storytelling. So if I can't get them to speak their own story, I will build a story from the components that they told me during the recording. So this is one of the reasons it could take me up to 16 to 20 hours of editing to get this thing working right. One of my early Bethel podcasts, I was interviewing my dentist and he was so nervous. Oh my God, the man was shaking. And he came with 9 typed pages of a script that he wanted to talk about. And I knew that was going to be a disaster. So I hit the record button and just let him go. And for 20 minutes, he read his pages. Hello, my name is Dr. So-and-so. I am a dentist, blah, 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 in this kind of nervous monotone. And when he finished, he just kind of looked at me, deer in the headlights. And I looked over his shoulder and said, your clock, is that a Yankees logo? And he gets all upset, like, that's the Mets. So we spent the next 20 minutes talking about baseball. And oh wow, so your dad used to play catch with you. Oh, that's great. Was your dad a dentist? No, I learned how to be a dentist in the Army. Oh, tell me about that. And so managed to get his story out that way. And it was a lot of editing, but we ended up with a fantastic conversation. He was casual, he was relaxed, and it was perfect. But it takes work to do that.
Okay. Hey, one more question before we move on here is terminology wise, just to make sure we have this clear. You've talked about network sites and hosting sites. Are those the same things or different things?
They could be the same, they could be different. Not all hosting sites have an ad network, but all ad networks are hosting sites. So, like I said, Anchor FM, I actually have a friend in Groton who does a weekly podcast, and it's hosted on Anchor FM, and he gets ads placed in there as a little extra bit of income. So, Anchor FM is one of the networking places that you can look into, see what podcasts are in their bailiwick, and say, okay, I would like to either put an ad on X number of podcasts, or I only want to hit podcasts that are reaching this demographic.
Okay, good. I think we have a little less than 10 minutes left, so I'll let you.
Okay, and we're in the final race here. Okay, you've got a podcast. You either as a guest or on your own. Now what? Seal, I've recorded a podcast. Now what? So you're going to want to add it to your website. This is Bart's Tree Service up in Danbury. I recorded them as part of the Bethel Business Podcast, and they put that under their About. One of the other podcasts I did for Bethel was my tax guy, and he added his podcast episode to his website. And a few months later, he was my tax guy. I call him and say, hey, it's January, time to start scheduling to do taxes. And he's like, I just want to let you know I got 27 new clients from this podcast. I'm like, well, really? Yeah, because when you're a tax guy, you get a lot of your business through referrals. And what's the first thing you do when you get a referral from someone? You Google them. They found his website, they listened to his podcast and said, wow, you really sound like you know what you're talking about. And you sound like a really interesting guy. I want to do business with you. So yes, you want to use, whether you're a guest on somebody else's podcast or your own, you want to market it. Email it to people. If you have a CRM and you do regular email blasts, you have a newsletter, put it on there. Hey, I was just interviewed by this podcast. Check it out. And of course, you're also going to want to put it on your social media. Again, your brief description. And the thing with social media, as I hope most of you know, you can't just post it once. So post it again a day later, slightly different description. Post it again a few days after that with a slightly different description. You're going to have to do it a few times. And then ask people to share it. That's how viral marketing works. Hey, everyone, check this out. Ask your friends to share it as well. I'm going to give a bit of a story on one of the podcasts I've recently done. This guy is Tom Knows. He's a cybersecurity expert. And we did one podcast, which was kind of generic. It was the how to keep hackers away when you're a small business person on a budget. 2 weeks after that podcast went out, he's like, okay, I want to do a very specific recording on a very narrow law in New York State. And this was the DFS cybersecurity regulation. And what he wanted to hit, he wanted a message specifically in New York, law firms, insurance agencies, and financial advisors. Because this specific law in New York State says you need to sign this document saying that we have done everything humanly possible to make sure our clients' data is safe. If you are hacked and the state can prove that you did not do everything physically possible to save your client's data, they're going after you, not the LLC, not the core, not the Inc. They're going after the person who signed that piece of paper. And this could be thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars in fines. So it was a really interesting podcast. So once we did that, we posted it on SoundCloud and YouTube, got the RSS feed, got the links, and started sending it out. Tom posted it on his Facebook page, so did his wife. Then he went into LinkedIn. Now, what he did, not only shared it on his feed and his profile, he went into LinkedIn groups. LinkedIn groups can be very, very powerful if you're a B2B market. And there are LinkedIn groups out there with people in legal, law firm, IT, places that are interested in keeping data safe from hackers. Again, insurance, lawyers, financial. And he posted and said, hey, everyone, I was recently interviewed on this podcast talking about this very specific New York State law. If you are a law firm in New York City or New York State, you really need to know about this. 24 hours after he posted that, he got a call from a law firm in Manhattan saying, we think we need you. 24 hours after that meeting, he ended up with a contract for $150,000, all from people listening to this one podcast. So this is a very, very powerful tool when used well. Now, someone mentioned video. You can do this. I actually listened to a hockey podcast. These 3 guys, 2 hours, twice a week, sit around chatting around hockey. And all they do was record them talking in a radio station. Except for nowadays, now they're recording 2 hours on a Zoom call. So you can do this. I don't because, again, video editing is a lot more complex than audio editing. And the way I edit, again, I edit out all the ums and the ahs and whatnot. You can't really do that with video unless you're doing multi-camera work. But if you just want to record people chatting and you don't mind if there's stutter or mumble, that's fine. You can do it. And there's a lot, you can see that on YouTube with this kind of podcasting. Now, that being said, I actually put all my podcasts on YouTube. It's because it's really good on Google because Google is YouTube. But a lot of people listen to podcasts on YouTube. But what I do is I create audiograms. And if you notice in the background here, there's this kind of odd shape. And work. Now, did you notice the movement in the background? I try to do that because even though this is an audio file only, when you post something on YouTube, you want to give them something to look at. Another audiogram, this is the one for the Danbury law firm I work with. This audiogram is showing sound waves. What's very cool with audiograms is you can use this purely for advertising as well. I see this a lot again in hockey. You can record a minute of your podcast as an audiogram and use it as a teaser. Hey, you'll never know what so-and-so said. You can have this teaser. To listen to the whole podcast, click on this link. So that way, when you're kind of spamming your social media feed, you can give them different things. You can have 5 different audiograms with 5 different minutes from your podcast. So they make great teasers. And so, like I said, I just use this when I'm posting things on YouTube. So to wrap it up, a few takeaways. Podcasts are still growing. They've been around since around 2005, and they're still growing and growing and growing. So something to always think about when you're thinking about ways to reach people, you're gonna keep that in there. Low cost of entry. Seriously, if you actually want to start experimenting with podcasts, if you have a phone and a few hours to play, you can start that way. The way I love it, it's a long form way to tell your story. If you're selling a widget, you may not need a podcast to explain your widget. However, if you're in something a little more complex, you're a scientist, you're a lawyer, you're a consultant, you're a coach, you can't just say everything you do in a 30-second elevator pitch. This is a great long form way to tell your story in depth. It's also, even though there's 850,000 podcasts out there, not everyone's making podcasts. If your competitors don't have a podcast, this is a great way to differentiate yourself from your competitors. And if they do have a podcast, again, a podcast almost again is its own business. You need to find a niche that is currently not being met. And again, this is a great way to showcase yourself as a thought leader in the market. Okay, we are up to our final questions, and thank you so much, everyone, for your time.
Merrill, I only have time for one question.
Okay.
And it is from Julie. Is, do people ever have to pay to listen to a podcast?
No, not unless it's behind a paywall like a Patreon. But for anything that's on Google, on iTunes, and the like, no. You can have closed podcasts, again, behind a paywall, but that won't get picked up by any of the search engines.
Okay, great. Well, Merrill, thank you very much for today's presentation. That's all the time we have for questions. As a reminder, recording this webinar and the materials are available within a couple of days on the fairfieldcounty.score.org website. Our next webinar is next Tuesday, August 4th at 12 noon, when we will be rebroadcasting one of our very popular webinars on social media marketing on a shoestring with Dory DiCarlo presenting. Please register for this webinar on our website. Again, SCORE offers free individual counseling, so please use the link on the screen to visit our website and click the Request a Mentor button. Also, please fill out your evaluations when you receive them at the end of the webinar. On behalf of SCORE, Merrill, thank you very much for presenting today. I'd also like to thank the Monroe Chamber of Commerce and the Monroe Library for partnering with SCORE Fairfield County on today's webinar. Thank you all for attending today's live webinar. Hope you have a nice day and stay healthy.
Have a good day.
Recording has ended.